The people of Ukraine have continued to demonstrate extraordinary resilience. The emergency services, volunteers, and family members work tirelessly to free people from under the rubble of damaged buildings or to recover the bodies of those killed so they can receive the dignity of a funeral and proper interment. The latest wave of attacks has further impacted aid operations and affected humanitarian workers. The number of humanitarian aid workers killed has more than tripled from 4 in 2022 to 15 in 2023. Another 35 were injured. The spike in attacks on aid storage facilities over the past 2 months has brought the number of incidents negatively impacting aid operations in 2023 to more than 50, the majority of them bombardments that have hit warehouses. In December alone, again as highlighted before, 5 humanitarian warehouses were damaged and burned to the ground in Kherson region, destroying tons of much-needed relief supplies, including food, shelter, materials, and medical supplies. As reported by Russian Federation authorities and discussed in this council on 30 December last year, recent attacks on Belgorod Oblast, not far from the Ukrainian border, caused the death of at least 25 civilians in Russia, including 5 children, and injuries to over 100. The attacks also reportedly resulted in damage to civilian infrastructure, including a university building. Mr. President, members of the Council, let me reiterate that international humanitarian law must be strictly respected at all times. International humanitarian law explicitly prohibits directing attacks against civilians and civilian objects, as well as indiscriminate attacks. This includes humanitarian personnel and assets. In addition, constant care must be taken throughout military operations to spare civilians and civilian objects. Mr. President, members of the Council, the scale of humanitarian needs in Ukraine remains vast, simply put. More than 14.6 million, about 40% of Ukraine's population requires some form of humanitarian assistance. 4 million people, including nearly 1 million children, are still displaced within the country. Over 6.3 million people continue to live as refugees in neighboring European countries and across the globe. Medical facilities have been hit relentlessly throughout the war. Since February 2022, 1,435 attacks on the health care system have been verified, including the killing of 112 health workers. At least 10 facilities have been damaged in the latest wave of aerial attacks. In the past 2 years, more than 3,000 education facilities have also been damaged or destroyed, many remaining educational facilities being used to accommodate displaced people or as aid distribution centers. As a result, almost 1 million war-affected children have no safe and reliable access to continue their education. The time lost will jeopardize the future of an entire generation. The war has also exposed millions of Ukrainians to heightened risk of gender-based violence, trafficking, and exploitation. Few sections of society have been unaffected. We have received reports of men, women, children from 4 years old to 80 years old who have been subjected to conflict-related sexual violence. This leads me to a deeper point about this war. Underneath the very evident physical repercussions for Ukraine and Ukrainians, there lurks a much less visible but no less damaging impact. Signs of a deeply rooted psychological trauma that could affect millions of people for years to come. Mr. President, despite the challenges and risks on the ground, the humanitarian community, 60% of them being Ukrainian organizations, continue to exert every effort to provide life-saving and life-sustaining assistance across Ukraine. This humanitarian response is being delivered in close coordination with and to complement the efforts of the Ukrainian government. And much is owed to the brave work of volunteers, civil society organizations, and other groups who risk their own lives to bring assistance and hope to people affected in their time of need. In particular, I welcome the huge efforts of Ukrainian women-led organizations who are stepping up to provide specialized assistance to displaced women and children who have experienced gender-based violence. However, a lack of humanitarian access persists. In particular, our access to areas occupied by Russian Federation remains significantly impeded. This is hugely concerning for hundreds of thousands of people living in occupied areas to the front line, close to the front line, where needs are most urgent. Again, international humanitarian law clearly requires the facilitation of rapid and unimpeded passage of humanitarian relief for all civilians in need. Obstructions that leave the civilian population without the essential to survive run contrary to this obligation under international humanitarian law. Mr. President, members of the Council, in 2023, humanitarian organizations, despite all these challenges, reached nearly 11 million people across Ukraine with some form of humanitarian assistance. This was only possible due to the staunch support of donors, and here I thank all the donors who have been generous in their support. By the end of 2023, more than $2.5 billion of the $3.9 billion requested under the humanitarian response plan had been received. But as this war continues unabated, driving high levels of humanitarian need, financial support must absolutely be sustained. This year's humanitarian needs and response plan for Ukraine, which will be launched in Geneva next week by the RCHC Denise Brown, is seeking $3.1 billion to assist 8. I urge all donors to once again step up to help the people of Ukraine. Mr. President, members of the Council, work also continues to address the wider global impacts of the war in Ukraine. Exports from Ukraine's Black Sea ports have continue to increase, despite Russian strikes on ports and related infrastructure and broader security concerns. On 27 December, a cargo ship traveling to the port of Izmail was damaged and grounded due to a reported sea mine explosion. This incident triggered an immediate spike in wheat futures, demonstrating the continued link between the safe navigation in the Black Sea and global food security. Ukrainian authorities have also reported continued drone and missile attacks on Odessa in recent weeks, resulting in civilian casualties, the destruction of homes, and further damage to port infrastructure. The Food and Agricultural Organization reports that global cereal prices rose by 1.5% in December, due in part to tensions in the Black Sea affecting wheat and maize exports. The Secretary General remains firmly committed to ensuring that food exports from the Russian Federation and Ukraine can traverse the Black Sea safely, predictably, and efficiently, and continues his engagement with the parties in a broad range of other stakeholders to this end. Mr. President, at the last Council meeting, where OCHA briefed on 6 December, we called for redoubled efforts to prevent a further deterioration of the humanitarian situation in Ukraine. We are deeply concerned that in the period since then, the war has instead intensified. Let me once again call for urgent attention to bring this war and the suffering of the people of Ukraine to an end. Thank you.
Je remercie Madame Loisornou de son exposé. Je donne à présent la parole aux membres du Conseil qui souhaitent faire une déclaration, à commencer par le représentant de l'Équateur.
Gracias, presidente. Y agradezco la exposición informativa de la Secretaria General Adjunta, Rosmarie Di Carlo, y de la Directora de Operaciones de la OCHA, Eden Wosorno. En poco se cumplirán 2 años de la agresión militar contra Ucrania y con ello se sigue sumando muertes, miseria y desaliento. El impacto severo y negativo contra la población civil, la infraestructura básica y contra el incremento de necesidades en la asistencia humanitaria debe parar. Ecuador rechaza los recientes ataques masivos aéreos con misiles y drones en varias localidades ucranianas y zonas residenciales y densamente pobladas, incluyendo, entre otras, Kiev, Odessa, Yarkov, Zaporilla, Leópolis y Dnipro. Estos ataques, desde el 29 de diciembre, según hemos escuchado de OCHA, han cobrado la vida de un centenar de civiles, entre ellos niños y mujeres, y más de 400 han resultado